Close your eyes now, if you have not already done so, and let the weight of the day begin to lift, slowly and quietly, from your shoulders and your chest and your tired hands. Let your breathing slow, just a little, just enough, so that each breath becomes a soft and steady thing, like the rhythm of distant rain against old glass. You are warm and you are safe, and there is nothing in this moment that requires anything of you except the gentle surrender to sleep. Let your thoughts grow quiet, one by one, the way candles are extinguished at the end of a long evening, in a room that was once full of people and noise, and now belongs entirely to the night. Breathe in, breathe out, and let us drift together, softly and without hurry, back through the long corridors of time, to a world lit by firelight and candlelight, and the faint glimmer of oil lamps, to a world where physicians moved through the shadows with their leather bags and their ancient remedies, and where the line between medicine and poison was so thin, so impossibly thin, that many a learned man never knew which side of it he stood on. Tonight, we are going to explore the long and quiet history of mercury, that silver liquid metal so beautiful in a glass vial, so treacherous in the human body, that accompanied humanity through centuries of illness and misunderstanding and genuine, sorrowful effort to heal. It is a story that moves slowly, the way all true histories move, through decades and centuries, and the patient turning of generations, from the apothecary shops of medieval Europe to the felt-lined workrooms of Victorian hatmakers, from the bedside of dying syphilis patients to the laboratories of early toxicologists, who began very gently and very carefully to understand what mercury was truly doing to the people who used it. If this voice helps you rest tonight, if this slow telling of old things helps your body grow heavy and your mind grow still, consider subscribing to this channel, but only if you are still awake enough to do so. We begin, as most stories of medicine begin, with a disease and with desperate human need. In the last years of the 15th century, a terrible and unfamiliar illness began to move through the populations of Europe with a steadiness and a thoroughness that made physicians and scholars, and clergy alike, reach for their pens and their prayers in equal measure. The disease that we now call syphilis, and which in those earliest years carried many names, depending on where one happened to be standing. When the suffering began, appeared in historical records with a particular clarity around the year 1495, when the armies of Charles VIII of France were laying siege to the city of Naples in the southern part of the Italian peninsula, that long and graceful land that extends into the Mediterranean Sea, like a boot extended in the direction of ancient civilizations. Among those soldiers, French and Italian and mercenary alike, a condition began to manifest that was unlike the familiar ailments of the age, unlike the plague that had swept Europe in the previous century, unlike the fevers and fluxes that soldiers had always endured in the field. It presented first as sores, then as a rash, then as deeper and more devastating damage to the skin and the bones and the nervous system. And it moved through the army camps, and then through the cities, and then through the trade routes of Europe, with a thoroughness that made it one of the defining medical events of its era. Historians believe that the epidemic spread rapidly after the dispersal of Charles VII's multinational army. In 1495, when soldiers returned to their home countries, carrying the disease with them into populations that had no established immunity and no effective treatment, the Italian physician Girolamo Fracastoro, writing in 1530 in his celebrated poem Syphilis Siv Morbus Gallicus, gave the disease its enduring name, borrowing it from a mythological shepherd boy named Syphilis, who was said to have been the first person afflicted, punished by the god Apollo for some forgotten act of irreverence. And in doing so, Fracastoro created not only a name, but a kind of cultural narrative, a story of punishment and suffering that would follow the disease through centuries of moral and medical discourse. The question of where syphilis originated, whether it came to Europe from the Americas with the returning cruise of Columbus in 1493, or whether it had existed in Europe in some form before that time, is one that historians and paleopathologists have debated with considerable patience and considerable disagreement for more than 5 centuries. And while the Columbian hypothesis remains the most widely held, the evidence continues to be examined and re-examined with the careful attention that such a significant question deserves. What is certain, and what matters most for our story tonight, is that by the first decade of the 16th century, syphilis was present throughout Europe, from the ports of Spain and Portugal to the courts of France and England, and the city-states of Germany and Italy, and physicians and healers and apothecaries were faced with the urgent and entirely unanswered question of what, if anything, could be done about it. It is into this atmosphere of urgent need and medical uncertainty that Mercury enters our story, and it enters with a quiet authority that belies the chaos of its arrival. For Mercury had been known to healers for a very long time, before syphilis gave it its defining purpose. The metal had been described in ancient Chinese and Indian texts, and the Arab physician Ibn Sina, known to the Latin reading world as Avicenna, had written about its properties in the 11th century. In his encyclopedic Canon of Medicine, a text that remained a foundational reference for European physicians through the medieval period and well into the Renaissance. Mercury was understood to be a substance of unusual and almost magical properties, a metal that flowed like water at room temperature, that gleamed with an inner light, that could be combined with other metals to form amalgams, and that had been used in various preparations to treat skin conditions, including mange and lice infestations, its ability to kill small organisms and parasites, being one of its earliest and most observable practical applications. When syphilis appeared with its distinctive skin lesions and its stubborn resistance to the remedies that physicians normally employed, it was perhaps natural, or at least understandable, in the context of the medical thinking of the time, that practitioners should turn to a substance already known to affect the skin and already associated with the treatment of dermatological conditions. The first recorded use of mercury in the treatment of syphilis dates to around the late 1490s and early 1500s, when practitioners in Italy and Spain began applying mercury ointments to the sores and lesions of afflicted patients, observing that in some cases the visible symptoms appeared to diminish, and recording their findings in the careful Latin prose of Renaissance medical writing. The treatment was painful and the results were inconsistent. But in a world without bacteriology, without the germ theory of disease, without any understanding of what syphilis actually was, or how it progressed through the body, even inconsistent results were better than no results, and Mercury's association with the treatment of syphilis was established with a firmness that would persist through refinements and reformulations and gradual modifications of technique for the next 400 years. The physician and alchemist Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, who called himself Paracelsus, and whose name alone seems to carry the weight of the age in which he lived, occupies a central and somewhat complicated position in the history of mercury as medicine. Born in 1493 in the Swiss Confederation, in the town of Einsiedeln, He grew up in a world where the borders between alchemy and medicine, between philosophy and observation, between the ancient and the new, were not yet firmly drawn, and his education moved between the mining districts of Carinthia, where his father was a physician who worked with metals and minerals, and the universities of Europe, where he absorbed and then systematically challenged the dominant medical traditions of his day. Paracelsus was not, by temperament or by reputation, a quiet man, and his rejection of the ancient Greek system of the four humours, his insistence that specific diseases required specific chemical treatments, rather than the vague balancing of bodily fluids, that Galenic medicine prescribed, and his habit of burning the works of Galen and Avicenna in public to demonstrate his contempt for their authority, made him one of the most controversial figures in the history of medicine. Yet within his considerable volatility, Paracelsus arrived at some genuinely important insights, and among them was a recognition, unusual for his time, that mercury was both a medicine and a poison, and that the difference between the two lay entirely in the dose. His dictum, rendered in the Latin that medical tradition required, as sola dosis facit venenum, meaning only the dose makes the poison, was articulated in his writings of the 1530s, and represents one of the foundational principles of modern toxicology, a field that would not exist as a formal discipline for several more centuries, but whose central logic Paracelsus had already grasped in the candlelit study of his restless and combative mind. He formulated mercury primarily as an ointment rather than as an oral preparation, recognizing that the risks of internal administration were considerable, and that topical application offered some degree of control over the quantity absorbed into the body, and this preference for the ointment over the ingested dose was a practical caution that, however imperfect, represented a genuine attempt to manage the toxicity of the substance he was prescribing. The ointment that Paracelsus preferred was only one of the forms in which mercury medicine was administered during the 16th century, and over the course of the following decades, practitioners expanded and elaborated the range of mercurial therapies with the characteristic thoroughness of an age that believed it was finally beginning to understand the natural world. The mercury fumigation bath, sometimes called the sweating tub, was among the most widely used of these treatments, and it operated on a logic that was coherent, if ultimately misguided, within the medical framework of the time. The patient, already weakened by the disease, and perhaps by the treatments already administered, would be placed inside a wooden tub or enclosed chamber, and mercury would be heated beneath or beside the chamber, so that the vapors rose around the patient's body, and the patient would remain inside the chamber, sweating profusely, inhaling the vapors for a period of time that varied according to the practitioner and the severity of the condition being treated. The intention was to drive the disease out of the body through the skin and through the excessive salivation that mercury reliably induced, a process that could produce several pints of saliva in a single day, and that was interpreted by physicians as evidence that the corrupted humours, or the corrupted matter of the disease, were being expelled from the body in a visible and measurable form. The excessive salivation caused by mercury, which is now understood as a consequence of mercury's effects on the glands and tissues of the mouth, was called patialism, and it was for a considerable time regarded not as a symptom of poisoning, but as a sign that the treatment was working, a misunderstanding so consequential and so persistent that it guided the dosing of mercury treatments for more than 2 centuries, with physicians often deliberately inducing the maximum salivation they could achieve before backing down the dose, believing that the more dramatic the salivation, the more thoroughly the disease was being expelled. Patients who underwent these treatments and who survived them often lost teeth and portions of their gums as a consequence of mercury's destructive effects on the tissues of the mouth. And the line between the symptoms of advancing syphilis and the symptoms of mercury poisoning was, in many cases, genuinely difficult for the physicians of the time to distinguish. A diagnostic confusion that added layer upon layer of suffering to what was already a very sorrowful situation. During this same period, the compound known as calomel, which is mercurous chloride, and which carries the chemical formula that later chemists would write as Hg2Cl2, was slowly entering the pharmacopoeia of European medicine, and its history is, in many quiet counterpart to the more dramatic story of the mercury fumigation bath, a slower and more domestic kind of poisoning, administered not in a sweating tub, but in the form of a white powder dissolved in liquid or pressed into a pill and taken by the patient at regular intervals over weeks and months, and sometimes years. Calomel appears to have originated, or at least to have been developed into a usable medical preparation, in China, and was adopted by Paracelsian physicians in Europe. During the 16th century, with its preparation requiring the heating of mercuric chloride with additional mercury to produce a compound that was less immediately toxic than mercuric chloride alone, less soluble in the body's fluids, and therefore somewhat slower in its effects, both its medicinal effects and its harmful ones. Records suggest that calomel was introduced into formal European medical practice around 1608, and over the following 2 centuries, it became one of the most widely prescribed substances in Western medicine, used not only for syphilis, but for malaria, yellow fever, intestinal parasites, constipation, and a range of other conditions for which it served as a powerful purgative, its ability to produce dramatic evacuation of the bowels being interpreted within the humoral framework and later within the framework of heroic medicine as evidence that it was purging the body of whatever was causing the illness. The name calomel itself is drawn from the Greek, kalos meaning good and melas meaning black, a pairing that referred not to the appearance of the powder, which was white, but to a reaction it produced when combined with ammonia, precipitating a finely dispersed black metallic mercury. And the name, however obscure its derivation, stuck with a tenacity that matched the substance's own persistence in the medical mainstream. It is worth pausing here, in the warm quiet of this telling, to consider the world in which these physicians and their patients lived, a world without the knowledge that we now carry so easily, without the understanding of bacteria and viruses and the molecular mechanisms of disease, without the laboratory instruments and the clinical trials and the accumulated centuries of careful observation that allow a modern physician to know with some confidence what a given substance will do inside a given body. The physicians of the 16th and 17th centuries were not foolish people. They were, many of them, genuinely learned, genuinely observant, genuinely motivated by the desire to reduce suffering, working with the best intellectual framework available to them, inheriting and refining traditions that stretched back to Galen and Hippocrates, and further still, reading the Arabic commentators and the Renaissance anatomists and one another, with the careful attention of scholars who understood that knowledge was cumulative and fragile and hard-won. When they looked at a patient with syphilis who had been treated with mercury and whose visible sores had diminished, they recorded what they saw, and what they saw was evidence, imperfect and incomplete, but real evidence that the mercury was doing something, that it was also doing other things, things that were damaging and sometimes fatal, was harder to see, partly because the damage accumulated slowly, partly because the symptoms of mercury poisoning could resemble the symptoms of the disease itself, and partly because the physicians of the time lacked the conceptual tools to understand systemic toxicity, to trace the invisible pathway from the substance administered to the harm done in distant tissues and organs and nerves. The tragedy of mercury medicine is not a story of negligence or cruelty, but a story of the limits of knowledge, and that is a story that deserves to be told with the same gentleness that we would wish for any story of sincere and well-intentioned human error. The 17th century brought with it an elaboration rather than a reduction in the use of mercurial medicines, as the trade routes of Europe carried both the disease and its silver remedy into new territories and new populations, and as the growing commerce in materia medica between Europe and its colonial possessions created a network of pharmaceutical exchange that would have been impossible in an earlier age. The apothecary shops of London and Paris and Amsterdam stocked mercury in its various preparations as ointments and pills and powders, and the ships of the East India Company and the Dutch East India Company carried calomel in their medicine chests, alongside the other remedies of European medicine, spreading mercurial treatment across Asia and Africa and the Americas with the same confidence with which they spread European culture and European disease. In England, the Royal College of Physicians, established in 1518 by Henry VI, had gradually accumulated authority over medical practice in London, and within the pharmacopoeias and formularies that emerged from that authority, mercury preparations occupied a central and largely unquestioned position, listed among the standard treatments for a range of conditions with the matter-of-fact brevity of things that everyone already knows. The mercury pill, sometimes called the blue mass or blue pill for the characteristic blue-grey colour, imparted by the elemental mercury suspended within the pill's binder of various plant-derived substances, became one of the most familiar objects of 17th century medicine, a small round thing pressed between the fingers of an apothecary and handed to a patient with instructions to take one or two at regular intervals, the mercury within it working its slow and ambiguous work in the quiet darkness of the body, sometimes reducing the visible symptoms of syphilis in its early stages, always accumulating in the tissues over time, always, with enough exposure, moving toward that invisible threshold at which the medicine became the poison. The public health saying that circulated in England during this period, reproduced in the medical literature, and apparently in general currency among the educated classes, captured with a particular dry wit the experience of syphilis patients undergoing mercury treatment. 2 minutes with Venus, 2 years with Mercury. The phrase, attributed variously in different sources, and surviving as a kind of folk wisdom, rather than a formally documented aphorism, acknowledged both the sexual transmission of the disease and the extraordinary duration of the treatment required, a treatment that was administered not in a single course, but continuously over months and years, as physicians believed that the disease required sustained suppression rather than a definitive cure, and as the visible sores and rashes of syphilis did indeed tend to diminish and recur, and diminish again in the cyclical pattern of the disease's natural progression, a pattern that could be interpreted either as evidence that the mercury was working, or as evidence that the disease was beyond the reach of any available medicine. The social dimensions of syphilis treatment were considerable. for the disease carried with it a moral weight that shaped how it was discussed, how it was treated, and how patients experienced the long and debilitating courses of mercury that physicians prescribed. To be treated for syphilis was to be known as someone who had acquired it, and the shame attached to that knowledge affected not only the patients themselves, but the physicians who treated them, who sometimes worked in conditions of considerable discretion, and the apothecaries who prepared the remedies, who were bound by professional custom, if not always by formal rule, to some degree of confidentiality. The soft candlelight of the apothecary's shop, the quiet scratch of the pen recording the prescription, the discreet wrapping of the mercury ointment in plain cloth, for a patient who could not afford to be seen carrying it openly through the streets. These small and human details are part of the history too, as much as the names of the physicians and the dates of the treatises and the chemical formulae of the compounds involved. Meanwhile, across the decades of the 17th century and into the 18th, calomel was quietly expanding its domain far beyond the treatment of syphilis, becoming a medicine prescribed for conditions that had nothing to do with infectious disease, a universal purgative and general remedy that physicians reached for with a confidence that later generations would find difficult to understand, but that made a kind of internal sense within the medical system of the time. It was given for malaria in the colonial territories of North America and the Caribbean, where the disease was endemic and where physicians had access to few other treatments. It was given for yellow fever, which periodically swept through the port cities of the Americas and Europe with devastating effect, and which physicians treated with heroic doses of calomel in the belief that the purging it induced was driving out the fever's cause. It was given in smaller doses to children suffering from teething discomfort and infantile constipation, a use that would persist with remarkable tenacity into the 20th century, when a Cincinnati pediatrician finally made the connection between the widespread administration of calomel to children and a condition called acrodynia, sometimes called pink disease, a painful and distressing illness of infancy, and characterized by redness and peeling of the hands and feet, irritability, and a range of neurological symptoms. And that was in essence chronic mercury poisoning administered under the name of medical care. The image of a mother giving her infant a powder that tasted slightly sweet and that the physician had assured her was mild and beneficial, while the mercury accumulated in the child's tissues, and the symptoms of poisoning developed so gradually that neither mother nor physician connected them to the remedy, is one of the more quietly devastating images in the history of medicine. And it is an image that deserves to be held gently, with the understanding that the people involved were doing what they believed to be right. Over the next century, as the 18th century settled into its particular character of Enlightenment rationalism and expanding empirical inquiry, the use of mercury in medicine continued to grow rather than diminish, reaching what historians of medicine have sometimes called its period of greatest excess in the decades between roughly 1750 and 1850, when the school of medicine known as heroic medicine had established itself as the dominant approach in Europe and North America, and when mercury in its various forms was administered in doses that we now recognize as acutely toxic, sometimes with the intention of producing dramatic effects that would demonstrate the vigor and thoroughness of the treatment. The physician Benjamin Rush, one of the founding figures of American medicine and a signatory to the Declaration of Independence, was among the most prominent advocates of heroic dosing in the New Republic, prescribing calomel in quantities of 10 times or more what Paracelsus had considered an upper limit, in the belief that dramatic purging and salivation were necessary to combat the dramatic diseases he was treating. And during the yellow fever epidemic that struck Philadelphia in 1793, killing perhaps 5,000 people out of a city of 50,000, Rush administered calomel in doses of up to 10 grains at a time, alongside other purging agents, a treatment that almost certainly contributed to the deaths of some of the patients he was trying to save. Rush was a brilliant man, a genuinely humane man, a man who argued for the humane treatment of the mentally ill at a time when such arguments were radical and unwelcome, and his embrace of heroic mercury dosing was not a failure of character, but a failure of the medical theory available to him, a theory that had no way to account for the cumulative toxicity of a heavy metal building up invisibly in the liver and kidneys and nervous system of a patient already weakened by disease. The death of George Washington in December of 1799 has been described by medical historians as one of the most consequential and sorrowful illustrations of heroic medicine in action. And while the primary treatment applied to Washington in his final illness was bloodletting, calomel was also administered in significant doses as part of the aggressive therapeutic program that his physicians, James Craik and Elisha Cullen Dick, brought to bear on what appears to have been a severe bacterial infection of the throat and airway. Washington fell ill on the evening of December 13th, 1799, at his estate of Mount Vernon in Virginia. And within 36 hours he was dead, aged 67 years. The calomel he received during those final hours contributed, along with the bloodletting and the other purging agents administered, to a physiological assault that his already struggling body was unable to withstand. And while the primary cause of death was almost certainly the infection itself, the treatment unquestionably hastened his decline and made his final hours more difficult than they needed to be. The story of Washington's death became, in the years that followed, a touchstone in debates about heroic medicine and its limits, cited by critics of the approach as evidence that even the most famous and revered patients were not protected from the consequences of medical theories that had outrun the evidence available to support them. It is worth noting that Elisha Dick, the youngest of Washington's 3 physicians, had argued against the heaviest bloodletting and had expressed reservations about the treatment plan, a moment of early skepticism that history has treated as a small, quiet act of prescience in an otherwise tragic story. It was during this same era of the late 18th and early 19th centuries that the connection between mercury and a distinctive cluster of neurological symptoms began to be formally described in the medical literature, though the recognition moved slowly and encountered considerable resistance from a medical establishment deeply invested in mercury as a therapeutic tool. The condition that would later be called erythism mercurialis, a term derived from the Greek ithizine, meaning to irritate or to provoke, was characterized by a constellation of symptoms that included excessive shyness and social withdrawal, irritability, emotional instability, tremors, memory difficulties, and in more severe cases, hallucinations and profound disorientation. The physician John Pearson, writing in 1805 in his work Practical Observations on the Venereal Disease and on the Use of Mercury, used the term erythism to describe the full range of mercury poisoning symptoms he had observed in syphilis patients treated with mercurial preparations, and in doing so provided one of the earliest systematic clinical descriptions of chronic mercury toxicity in the English medical literature. Pearson's work did not immediately transform medical practice, for the forces of institutional inertia and commercial interest and genuine uncertainty about alternatives were all working against a rapid shift in the medical consensus on mercury. But his observations were noted, discussed, and slowly absorbed into the growing body of evidence that would eventually, over the following century and a half, bring mercury's reign as a universal medicine to its end. The symptoms Pearson described were recognizable to anyone who had spent time in the wards, where syphilis patients underwent mercury treatment, or in the homes of hatmakers and mirror silverers and other workers whose trades brought them into prolonged contact with mercury vapor. And the quiet accumulation of these recognitions in the writings of physicians and the complaints of patients and the observations of industrial reformers was the beginning of the long process of understanding that mercury was not, and had never been, primarily a medicine, somewhere in the felt-lined workshops of England and France and the hat-making cities of the eastern United States. A different chapter of mercury's history was unfolding, one that had nothing to do with physicians or pharmacopoeias or the treatment of syphilis, and everything to do with the craft of making hats. The process of felt hat manufacture, as it had developed through the 17th and 18th centuries, relied on a technique called carroting, in which the fur of small animals, most commonly rabbit or beaver, was treated with a solution of mercurous nitrate to roughen the surface of the fibers and allow them to mat together into the dense, smooth felt that fashionable society required for its hats and its bonnets and its tall stovepipe constructions of the kind that a gentleman of the early 19th century would not have considered himself properly dressed without. The name carroting came from the orange-red color that the mercury nitrate solution imparted to the treated fur, a color that reminded someone at some point in the early history of the process of a carrot, and the name adhered with the casual permanence of workshop vocabulary. The hat makers who carried out this process worked in rooms that were often poorly ventilated, bending over vats of the solution, brushing it onto the fur with flat wooden paddles, and then steaming the treated felt to encourage the fibers to mat together. And with each application and each steaming, mercury vapor rose into the air of the workshop and was inhaled by the workers standing over it, breathed in with the unthinking regularity of a man who has never been told that what he breathes might do him harm. Over weeks and months and years of this work, the mercury accumulated in the nervous systems of the hat makers, producing first the subtle symptoms that might have been attributed to any number of other causes: the slight trembling of the hands, the occasional difficulty finding words, the uncharacteristic irritability, and then, with continued exposure, the more unmistakable signs of neurological damage: the pronounced tremors, the shuffling gait, the emotional volatility that could tip without warning from sullenness into agitation, the quality that observers described, with the imprecise but evocative language of ordinary speech, as madness. The cities of the hat-making trade carried mercury's mark in particularly concentrated form. In Danbury, Connecticut, which had established itself by the early 19th century as the hat-making capital of the United States, the tremors associated with chronic mercury poisoning among hat workers became sufficiently common and sufficiently recognizable that they acquired their own local name, the Danbury Shakes, a phrase that workers and townspeople used without, for many decades, fully understanding what it described or what was causing it. The first formal medical description of mercurialism among hat workers in the United States was published by a physician named J. Addison Freeman in the Transactions of the Medical Society of New Jersey in 1860, a careful and observant account of the symptoms he had seen in workers employed in the hat-making establishments of that region, noting the tremors and the neurological changes and the emotional disturbances that distinguished the condition. Though Freeman's report, published in a provincial medical journal in the year that the American Civil War was beginning to gather its terrible momentum, did not immediately reach a wide audience or produce the regulatory response that its findings might have warranted. The connection between hat making and the distinctive neurological presentation of mercury poisoning was thus known to the medical community, at least in outline, by the 1860s. And it is this background of professional and popular awareness that gives the figure of Lewis Carroll's mad hatter, published in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland in 1865, a particular cultural resonance, even if the scholarly consensus holds that Carroll's specific model for the character was almost certainly a furniture dealer and eccentric of Oxford named Theophilus Carter, who was known locally as the Mad Hatter, because of his habit of always wearing a top hat and his tendency toward unconventional opinions, and who showed no signs of mercury poisoning. The culture had absorbed enough of the hatmaker's peculiar affliction that a Mad Hatter needed no further explanation, and in that absorption, the suffering of generations of working men and women had been transformed into a piece of literary shorthand that would endure long after the men themselves were forgotten. It is worth noting, during this period of the mid-19th century, that the debate within medicine about the safety and utility of mercury had been growing more pointed and more public for several decades, driven in part by the rise of alternative medical movements that made the toxicity of orthodox medicine one of their central arguments. The homeopathic movement, founded by Samuel Hahnemann in Germany in the late 18th century, and spreading steadily through Europe and North America in the first half of the 19th, was particularly vocal in its criticism of mercury therapy, and Hahnemann himself devoted considerable energy to documenting what he called the chronic disease of mercurialism, arguing that physicians who prescribed calomel and other mercurials were producing a new and artificial disease in their patients, on top of whatever condition they had set out to treat. A verse that circulated in popular print in 1825 captured the sentiment with the bluntness of popular satire. Since calomel's become their boast, how many patients have they lost? How many thousands they make ill? Of poison with their calomel, the rhyme imperfect and the sentiment clear. A small window into the degree to which ordinary people were beginning to question the metal's ubiquity in their medicine cabinets. The botanical medicine movement in the United States, associated with figures like Samuel Thomson, also made the abandonment of mineral medicines, including mercury, a central feature of its appeal. And Thomson's followers, who called themselves Thomsonians, operated a network of friendly botanic societies that offered medical advice and plant-based remedies as an alternative to the mercurial treatments of regular physicians. These movements were, by the standards of established medicine, unorthodox, and in some cases genuinely dangerous in their own ways. But their critique of mercury was not without foundation, and the pressure they exerted on orthodox practitioners to examine the evidence for their most toxic remedies was part of the complex social process by which medical practice was slowly reformed. The question of what mercury was actually doing to the body of the syphilis patient, and whether it was doing anything beneficial at all, was one that required the development of the germ theory of disease before it could be answered with any clarity, and the germ theory, in its mature and practically applicable form, did not arrive until the work of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch in the second half of the 19th century had established with sufficient rigor the principle that specific diseases were caused by specific microorganisms, and that effective treatment required either killing those organisms or preventing them from causing further damage. The bacterium responsible for syphilis, Treponema pallidum, was identified by the German researchers Fritz Schaudin and Erich Hoffmann in 1905, after more than 4 centuries of mercury treatment carried out in complete ignorance of what the disease was or what the mercury was doing to it. And the identification of the causative organism opened the way for the development of treatments that were genuinely targeted at the disease rather than at its symptoms. Paul Ehrlich, the German physician and immunologist whose work on the selective toxicity of chemical compounds is established theoretical basis for modern chemotherapy, turned his attention to syphilis after the identification of Treponema pallidum. And in 1909, working with his Japanese colleague Sahachiro Hata, he discovered that compound 606, an arsenic-based drug that Ehrlich named salvarsan, was effective against the organism in animal models. And by 1910, it had been demonstrated to be effective in human patients, representing the first genuinely targeted chemical treatment for a specific bacterial infection in the history of medicine. The arrival of salvarsan did not immediately end mercury's role in syphilis treatment, for old remedies die slowly when physicians have trusted them for generations, and mercury ointments and blue pills continued to be prescribed alongside the new arsenic compounds well into the early decades of the 20th century. But the intellectual framework that had sustained mercury's position as the primary treatment for syphilis was now fatally undermined, and the slow withdrawal of mercury from the syphilis pharmacopoeia had begun. The world that salvarsan entered in 1910 was a world that was simultaneously beginning to see mercury in new and troubling contexts, not only in medicine but in industry, where the growing understanding of occupational disease was bringing the experiences of hat makers and mirror, silverers and thermometer makers and felt workers into the formal language of public health and labour reform. The industrial reformers and occupational physicians of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, working in the tradition established by Bernardino Ramazzini, the Italian physician who in 1700 had published his foundational work, De Morbis Artificum Diatriba, or Diseases of Workers, the first systematic treatment of occupational medicine in the Western tradition, were accumulating evidence from workshops and factories that the diseases of mercury workers were real, were serious, were preventable, and were being systematically ignored by the employers and the regulatory authorities, whose interest in the continued profitability of the trades involved was more immediate than their concern for the workers who carried out those trades. Ramazzini had described mercury poisoning in miners and gilders, and mirror makers with the careful attention of a physician who believed that a man's work was as much a part of his medical history as his diet or his ancestry, and his work had established a tradition of observational occupational medicine that others continued through the 18th and 19th centuries, even as the pace of industrialization brought new categories of mercury-exposed workers into existence, faster than the medical literature could. The hat-making industries of England and the United States, the mining of cinnabar in Spain and Italy, the manufacture of scientific instruments and thermometers, the production of mirrors using mercury amalgam processes. All of these trades left their quiet marks on the bodies of the workers involved, marks that accumulated over years and decades, and that were often misread or dismissed by physicians who lacked the framework to connect a worker's trembling hands to the mercury vapor he had breathed for the past 20 years. It is in this slow accumulation of evidence, in the movement of knowledge from the bedside and the workshop and the laboratory to the medical journal and the public health report, and eventually to the regulatory statute, that the final chapters of mercury medicine's long dominance begin to take shape. Though the process was neither swift nor straightforward, and the interests arrayed against the recognition of mercury's harms were considerable and persistent. The mercury in trade medicine represented enormous commercial value, accumulated in the pharmacopoeias and the supply chains and the professional habits of centuries, and the physicians and apothecaries and industrialists who had built their practices and their livelihoods around it did not readily surrender their attachment to a substance that had served, or appeared to serve, so many purposes for so long. The calomel prescribed to children as teething powder, to choose one example that illustrates the depth and the domesticity of mercury's penetration into everyday life, continued to be available and to be used well into the 20th century, despite the accumulating evidence of its harms, because the pattern of childhood illness it produced was subtle enough to be attributed to other causes, because physicians trusted their own experience with the remedy over the theoretical objections of critics, and because the commercial interests of the pharmaceutical companies that manufactured it were not aligned with a rapid withdrawal from the market. The recognition, when it finally came, that acrodynia, the mysterious and distressing illness of infants and young children that had been a feature of pediatric wards in the early 20th century, was caused by mercury in the teething powders and laxatives that parents had been giving their children in good faith, came slowly and through the determined work of a small number of physicians who were willing to pursue an unpopular hypothesis against the resistance of established practice. And so the story of mercury medicine, which had begun in the candlelit apothecary shops of the 16th century, with the desperate attempt to find something, anything, that might slow the progress of a terrifying new disease, moved through 4 centuries of gradual, patient, and often painful accumulation of understanding toward a reckoning that was not dramatic, not sudden, but quiet and incremental, the way that most genuine changes in medicine actually happen, not in a single moment of revelation, but in the slow turning of a consensus built from thousands of individual observations made in thousands of separate rooms by thousands of separate people who each saw one piece of a picture that none of them could see whole. The hat makers of Danbury and the syphilis patients of 16th century Naples and the children given teething powder in London in 1920 were part of the same story, connected by a single silver substance that moved through the history of medicine with a persistence that was almost elegant in its endurance, and that left in its passage a record of human ingenuity and human error and human suffering and human care that is in its entirety one of the most illuminating chapters in the long and continuing story of how human beings have tried to understand the world well enough to heal one another. The night is quiet, and the history is long, and there is more still to tell of Mercury's journey through the laboratories of the 20th century and the international treaties of the 21st, through the mines of Spain and the rivers of Japan, and the broken thermometers of 1 million schoolrooms, through all the ways that this single element, the only metal that is liquid at the ordinary temperature of an ordinary room, wove itself into the fabric of human civilization, and then had to be, with great care and great difficulty, unwoven from it again. The 19th century moved at a pace that felt, to the people living within it, like the piece of enormous and accelerating change, a sense that the world was being remade faster than any previous generation had known, that the old certainties of medicine and science and social organization were giving way to new ones with a speed that was sometimes exhilarating and sometimes deeply unsettling. And Mercury was present throughout this transformation, in ways both obvious and invisible, a constant thread running through the fabric of an age that was simultaneously discovering the tools it needed to understand Mercury's harms and resisting with the considerable inertia of established practice the implications of what those tools revealed. The industrial cities of England and the northeastern United States were growing rapidly in these decades, drawing populations from the countryside into the workshops and factories and hat-making establishments, where mercury exposure was a daily and unremarked condition of employment. And the medical institutions of the era, the hospitals and dispensaries and medical societies, were beginning to accumulate in their records the patterns of illness that would eventually, when someone looked at them with the right framework in mind, resolve into a coherent picture of occupational mercury poisoning. The London dispensaries that served the working poor, institutions like the General Dispensary in Aldersgate Street, founded in 1770, or the Public Dispensary in Carey Street, recorded in their case books the trembling hands and irritable temperaments and dental decay of workers from the nearby trades, without always connecting these presentations to a single cause. Because the logic of causation in medicine was still being assembled piece by piece, still waiting for the germ theory and the epidemiological methods that would make it possible to trace an effect back to its origin with confidence. The physicians who worked in these institutions were not incurious men, and many of them wrote careful descriptions of what they observed, descriptions that read now like unconscious testimonies to the mercury that their patients had been breathing and absorbing for years, though at the time they were filed under categories like nervous debility or constitutional weakness, or the vague and encompassing diagnosis of tremors, which told the patient and the physician very little about what was happening, and nothing at all about how to prevent it. It is worth noting that the legal framework for addressing occupational disease in Britain during this period was almost entirely absent. The Factory Acts that began to be passed from 1833 onward concerned themselves primarily with the conditions of child labour in textile mills, and had nothing to say about the mercury vapour in hat-making establishments, or the mercury used in the silvering of mirrors, and the doctrine of common employment, which held that an employer was not liable for injuries caused by one worker to another, and which the courts had interpreted broadly, effectively prevented most workers from seeking legal remedy for the illnesses their work had given them. The Mines Act of 1842 had prohibited the employment of women and children underground, but the mines where cinnabar was extracted in Spain, and the mines in other parts of the world where mercury ore was brought to the surface, remained largely unregulated in terms of the health of the miners, and the mercury that left those mines as liquid metal or as refined compound moved through a supply chain of complete legal impunity, arriving at the apothecary and the hat maker and the physician alike. without any requirement that anyone along the route account for the harm it might do. The reformers who were beginning to challenge this situation were working against a combination of economic interest and epistemic uncertainty, a combination that is always among the most difficult to overcome because the uncertainty provided the economic interest with a respectable argument, namely that the harms had not been proven, that the evidence was still incomplete, that further study was needed before any action could be justified, an argument that has a surface plausibility in any scientific context, and that was particularly effective in an era when the standards of proof for a causal connection between a substance and a disease were still being established. Thomas Legge, who would later become the first medical inspector of factories in England and who would in the early 20th century do much to establish the institutional framework for occupational health in Britain, was not yet born when the worst decades of Mercury hat making were unfolding and his predecessor in the tradition of occupational medicine, the tradition that stretched back through the English physician Charles Turner, Thakrahata Ramazzini, was doing important work, but had not yet accumulated the institutional authority that would be needed to produce legislative change. The slow turning of that institutional wheel, the movement from isolated medical observation to published report, to public debate, to regulatory action, would take the better part of the 19th century to complete even for the most visible and well-documented cases of occupational mercury poisoning, and for those that were less visible, less well-documented, or entangled with more powerful economic interests, it would take considerably longer still. The light in the workshop fell the same way every morning, soft and grey through the small windows, and the workers arrived as they always had. And the mercury was heated as it always had been, and the felt was treated, and the hats were made, and the trembling of hands that might have been noticed, had anyone been watching with the right eyes, continued its quiet accumulation in the bodies of men and women who had no name for what was happening to them. Across the Atlantic Ocean, in the growing cities of the eastern United States, the hat-making trade had established itself with particular concentration. In the state of Connecticut and the city of Danbury had become, by the middle of the 19th century, one of the most productive centers of felt hat manufacture in the world, its workshops and small factories, turning out millions of hats annually for a domestic market that was, at the height of the industry's prosperity, purchasing hats at a rate that seems extraordinary by any modern reckoning. Every man of any social standing possessing multiple hats for different occasions and different seasons, and the social codes that govern their use being more elaborate and more rigorously observed than anything that the contemporary world has retained. The felt hat was not merely an item of practical clothing in this era. It was a signifier of social position and professional identity and moral respectability, and the industry that produced it was correspondingly prosperous and influential in the regions where it concentrated, providing employment for thousands of workers and economic foundations for dozens of smaller towns and villages in the surrounding area. The mercury used in Danbury's hat-making establishments came primarily from the Almaden mines in Spain, the same ancient mines that had been worked since Roman times, and possibly earlier, mines whose cinnabar deposits were so extensive and so rich that they had supplied most of the world's mercury for centuries, and which were still, in the 19th century, among the most productive mercury-producing operations on Earth. The cinnabar from Almaden was shipped to ports on the eastern seaboard of the United States, and then transported inland to the hat-making regions, arriving in heavy iron flasks that were the standard containers for liquid mercury in international trade, and converted in the workshops into mercurous nitrate solution for the carotting process, that fundamental step in felt production, without which the fibers would not mat properly, and the hat would not hold its shape through the seasons of wear and weather that a well-made hat was expected to endure. The workers who carried out the carotting, who spent their days bent over the vats of solution and the steaming felt, were mostly men, skilled workers in a trade that had its own hierarchy and its own customs and its own pride, and they were not, in general, people who complained readily about the conditions of their work, partly because the culture of skilled trades in this period did not reward complaint, and partly because the symptoms of mercury poisoning, arriving gradually and mimicking the ordinary ailments of working life, the aching joints and the nervous irritability, and the occasional confusion that anyone might attribute to a hard week's work or a difficult domestic situation, did not immediately present themselves as something exceptional or worth bringing to a physician's attention. The Danbury Shakes, when they became recognizable enough to acquire that name, were understood by those who used the term to be a consequence of the hat-making trade, an occupational peculiarity, in the same way that a coal miner's cough was understood to be a consequence of coal mining, without anyone necessarily understanding what coal dust or mercury vapor was doing at the level of the lung or the nerve, and without that understanding being readily available from a medical establishment that was, in this period, still working out the basic science of toxicology. The physician J. Addison Freeman, whose 1860 paper in the Transactions of the Medical Society of New Jersey represented the first formal American medical description of mercury, poisoning in hat makers, was careful and precise in his clinical observations, noting the characteristic tremors that began in the hands and spread to the arms, and eventually to the entire body, the emotional lability that alternated between depression and agitation, the insomnia and the excessive shyness and the difficulty concentrating that his hat-making patients presented, and while his paper did not produce immediate regulatory action, it entered the medical literature and contributed to the slow accumulation of formal knowledge about occupational mercury poisoning that would eventually support the arguments for reform. The Civil War, which began in the year after Freeman's paper was published, and which absorbed the attention and the resources of American society for 4 devastating years, interrupted the development of any sustained regulatory response to occupational disease in the hat-making industry, and the decades that followed the war brought their own preoccupations of industrial expansion and labor conflict and rapid urbanization that kept the specific problem of hat makers' mercury poisoning from the top of any legislative agenda. The city of Danbury continued to make hats, and the mercury continued to be used. And the men and women who worked in the workshops continued to develop the tremors and the neurological changes that Freeman had described. And the world went on with the patient indifference to individual suffering that the world so often displays when the suffering in question is distributed quietly across a population of workers rather than concentrated dramatically in a single visible event. The hat sat on the head of the gentleman as he walked down the street of the American city, and he did not know, and perhaps could not have been expected to know, the long story of silver mercury that had passed through human hands to bring it to him. The story of mercury in the 19th century is also, and importantly, a story about the chemistry of the substance itself about the gradual and painstaking development of the scientific understanding of what mercury is, how it behaves in different chemical forms, how it enters the human body and moves through the tissues, and accumulates in particular organs. And this chemical understanding, built up through the work of European and American scientists, across the course of the century, formed the intellectual foundation without which no effective regulatory or therapeutic response to mercury's harms was possible. The Swedish chemist Jöns Jacob Berzelius, working in the first half of the 19th century, made fundamental contributions to the systematic chemistry of mercury, determining its atomic weight and clarifying the distinction between its two principal oxidation states, the mercurous compounds in which mercury exists in a lower valence, including calomel, and the mercuric compounds in which it exists in a higher valence, including the highly toxic mercuric chloride, a distinction that had practical implications for the relative toxicity of different mercury preparations, even if those implications were not immediately incorporated into medical practice. The German chemist Justus von Liebig, whose contributions to organic chemistry and agricultural chemistries made him one of the dominant scientific figures of the mid-19th century, also worked on mercury compounds in the context of his broader investigations of organometallic chemistry and the synthesis of organomercury compounds, in which mercury is bonded to carbon-containing organic groups, began in European laboratories during this period, opening a new category of mercury chemistry whose significance for toxicology and medicine would not be fully understood for several more decades. The development of analytical chemistry during the 19th century, including the gradual refinement of methods for detecting and measuring the presence of specific elements in biological samples, made it increasingly possible, at least in principle, to demonstrate the presence of mercury in the tissues of people who had been exposed to it. And while the analytical methods of the mid-19th century were crude by modern standards, they provided the first empirical demonstrations that mercury administered as medicine or inhaled as vapor did in fact accumulate in the body rather than passing harmlessly through it, a finding that had significant implications for the theoretical defense of mercurial medicine. The work of the English physician Alfred Swain Taylor, who held the chair of medical jurisprudence at Guy's Hospital in London, and who is regarded as one of the founders of forensic medicine in Britain, included careful investigations of mercury poisoning in the context of both accidental and intentional ingestion, and his textbook on poisons in relation to medical jurisprudence and medicine, first published in 1848 and running through multiple editions, contained a detailed account of mercury's toxic effects that was read by physicians and lawyers and coroners throughout the English-speaking world, helping to establish in the medical mainstream the understanding that mercury was a genuine and serious poison, even as many of those same physicians continued to prescribe it in its calomel form as a matter of routine. The tension between the forensic and toxicological literature, which by mid-century was painting an increasingly clear picture of mercury's harms, and the therapeutic tradition, which continued to recommend mercury in a wide range of conditions, was one of the characteristic intellectual discomforts of 19th century medicine, a discipline that was being pulled simultaneously toward empirical rigor and away from it by the weight of centuries of practice and the genuine absence, in many cases, of anything better to offer. The pharmaceutical companies that were beginning to emerge as organized commercial entities in this period, distinct from the individual apothecaries of an earlier era, and organized to manufacture and distribute remedies on an industrial scale, had an obvious commercial interest in the continued prescribability of their mercury-containing products, and the relationship between commercial interest and scientific evidence in medicine was already, in the 19th century, complex enough to slow the translation of toxicological knowledge into therapeutic change. The medical journals of the era, the Lancet in England, founded in 1823, the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal in the United States, founded in 1828, the Edinburgh Medical and Surgical Journal, carried articles both defending and questioning mercury's therapeutic role, and the debate conducted through their pages over the course of the century reflected the genuine uncertainty of a discipline trying to update itself in real time, using evidence that was incomplete and methods that were still being developed about a substance that had been central to its practice for 400 years. It is in this context of genuine intellectual struggle, of real uncertainty and real evidence pulling in different directions, that the persistence of mercury medicine through the 19th century becomes most understandable, if not most defensible. And it is with that understanding that one can approach the history with something other than retrospective judgment, recognizing that the physicians of the age were doing the best they could with what they had, even as what they had was insufficient to protect the patients who trusted them. The mirror makers of Venice and the mirror silverers of the workshops of Paris and London belong to a chapter of Mercury's history that is less often told than the stories of the hat makers and the syphilis patients. But that is no less sorrowful in its particulars and no less illuminating in what it reveals about the ways that Mercury moved through the material culture of the pre-industrial and early industrial world. The production of glass mirrors, which had become one of the luxury industries of early modern Europe, after Venetian craftsmen on the island of Murano developed and refined the techniques of mirror making in the 16th and 17th centuries, relied for much of its history on a process called tin amalgam silvering, in which a thin layer of tin foil was spread on a flat surface. Liquid mercury was poured over it to form a reflective amalgam. The glass plate was pressed carefully onto the amalgam and left under weights for a period of days while the amalgam adhered to the glass, and the excess mercury was then drained away, leaving behind the thin, gleaming reflective coating that gave the mirror its quality. The mercury used in this process was not fully recovered, and the draining that followed the amalgamation's step released mercury vapor into the air of the workshop. With every repetition of the operation, and the workers who spent their days in these workshops, pressing glass and pouring mercury and draining the excess into collection vessels that were never perfectly sealed, breathed an atmosphere that was chronically contaminated with mercury vapor at levels that we now know to be capable of producing neurological damage with prolonged exposure. The Great Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, completed in 1684, under the direction of the architect Jules Hardouin Mansart for Louis XIV, and containing 357 mirrors of exceptional quality arranged along the western gallery of the palace, stands as one of the most celebrated achievements of the mirror-making craft, and the workers who produced those mirrors, whose names were never recorded in the histories that celebrated the hall, worked with mercury in ways that almost certainly left marks on their bodies that no historian has ever traced. The Venetian authorities, who understood that the mirror-making techniques of Murano were a commercial secret of great value to the Serene Republic, went to considerable lengths to prevent the skilled workers of Murano from emigrating. and carrying those techniques elsewhere. And when French agents succeeded in luring several Murano mirror makers to Paris in the 1660s to help establish a mirror industry that would reduce France's dependence on Venetian imports, the Venetian Council of Ten is said to have sent agents to Paris with instructions to persuade the workers to return by whatever means necessary. And the physicians who were consulted about the ailments of mirror workers in this period, the trembling and the mood changes, and the deteriorating health that accompanied long service in the trade, had no concept of occupational toxicology that would have allowed them to connect these ailments to the mercury the workers handled daily. The process of mirror silvering using tin amalgam was not replaced until the 1830s, when the German chemist Justus von Liebig developed the silver mirror reaction, a method of depositing a thin film of metallic silver onto glass from a solution of silver nitrate reduced by an aldehyde, which produced a clearer and more uniform reflective surface, and which did not require the use of mercury. And this chemical innovation, which Liebig developed in the context of his broader organic chemistry research, rather than with any particular intention of addressing mercury poisoning in the mirror industry, had the effect of gradually eliminating mercury from the mirror-making trade. One of the earlier examples in the history of industrial chemistry, in which a technological advance happened also to reduce occupational mercury exposure. The tin amalgam process continued in use in some places well after Liebig's silver mirror reaction had been demonstrated, partly because of the expense of silver and partly because of the conservative habits of established industries. But by the second half of the 19th century, the mirror-making trade was no longer among the primary sources of occupational mercury poisoning, its place in that unhappy category having been taken by other industries, whose expansion was a consequence of the broader industrialization of the century. The thermometer and barometer industries, which used liquid mercury in their instruments, with a directness and an intimacy that made exposure almost inevitable. The felt hat industry, the chemical industry, with its growing production of mercurial compounds for agricultural and other uses, the dental profession with its mercury amalgam fillings. All of these trades and professions kept mercury moving through the bodies of workers and patients through the latter half of the 19th century and well into the 20th, maintaining mercury's presence in human life, even as its role as a formal medicine was beginning slowly to contract. The dental use of mercury deserves particular attention in any complete account of mercury's history, because it represents a form of mercury exposure that has continued from the 19th century into the present day, that has affected not a marginal population of industrial workers, but the general population of the developed world, and that has generated a debate about safety and harm that continues with considerable heat and considerable division into the contemporary moment. Silver amalgam dental fillings, composed of a mixture of liquid mercury with an alloy of silver, tin, copper, and sometimes zinc, were introduced into dental practice in France in the 1820s and spread rapidly to England and the United States in the 1830s, where their ease of preparation and application, their relatively low cost, and their durability compared to the gold fillings and other materials previously available made them rapidly attractive to dentists and patients alike. The adoption of amalgam fillings in the United States was not without controversy from its earliest days. The first amalgam war, as it has been called by historians of dentistry, erupted in the late 1830s and early 1840s, when the American Society of Dental Surgeons, founded in 1840, required its members to sign a pledge not to use amalgam fillings on the grounds that the mercury they contained was dangerous to patients, a position that the society maintained for several years before the practical advantages of amalgam and the commercial pressures of the dental marketplace overwhelmed the opposition, and the society dissolved in 1856, its membership having drifted back to amalgam in the face of a competitor material that genuinely worked better for most applications than anything else readily available. The chemistry of amalgam is such that the mercury in a filling is bound in an alloy that releases mercury at far lower rates than liquid mercury or mercury vapor, and the debate about whether those lower rates of release are nonetheless sufficient to cause harm to the patient has been the central technical question in the ongoing controversy about amalgam safety, a question that has been addressed by hundreds of studies over more than a century. And that has produced conclusions ranging from confident reassurance to genuine concern, depending on the methodology of the study and the interests of the investigators. The dentists who prepared amalgam fillings by hand mixing the mercury and the alloy powder, kneading the amalgam between their fingers to achieve the right consistency, before packing it into the prepared tooth cavity, were themselves exposed to mercury vapor at levels that were not trivial, and that in some cases, particularly among those who worked without adequate ventilation and who handled large volumes of amalgam over long careers, produced the subtle signs of chronic mercury exposure, the slight tremor and the occasional memory difficulty, and the emotional changes that were by the late 19th century becoming recognizable as symptoms of a specific and identifiable condition. The dental profession's relationship with mercury was thus both an external one, in which dentists administered a mercury-containing material to their patients, and an internal one, in which dentists themselves were occupationally exposed to the substance they were placing in others, a dual character that made the profession a site of particular interest to the occupational physicians and toxicologists, who were slowly building the case for better regulation of mercury across all its uses. The question of whether patients with amalgam fillings received a dose of mercury sufficient to cause measurable harm was addressed in a number of studies through the 20th century, and the regulatory responses to those studies varied considerably between countries, with some jurisdictions restricting or prohibiting amalgam fillings in pregnant women and children, while maintaining their use in the general adult population, and others continuing to regard amalgam as safe for all patients, pending definitive evidence of harm, a cautious position that reflects both the genuine complexity of the science and the practical difficulty of finding a universally acceptable substitute that matches amalgam's durability and cost-effectiveness. The history of amalgam is not, in the end, a simple story of a harmful substance recklessly applied, but a genuinely difficult case study in the challenge of regulating a material whose harms, if they exist at the levels of exposure involved, are subtle enough to be difficult to measure and to disaggregate from the many other factors that affect human health, and whose benefits, in terms of durable, accessible dental care for a large population, are concrete and well established and not easily dismissed. The figure of Paul Ehrlich, who has already appeared briefly in this account in the context of his development of salvarsan, deserves a more complete treatment, for his work represents not only a turning point in the specific history of mercury as a treatment for syphilis, but a transformation in the fundamental logic of medicine that ultimately made the entire framework supporting Mercury's therapeutic role obsolete, replacing it with a new framework of targeted chemical therapy in which the specificity of the agent mattered as much as its general toxicity, and in which the goal was not to produce dramatic effects in the body, but to kill a specific organism or interrupt a specific biological process with the minimum necessary collateral damage to the patient. Ehrlich was born in 1854 in Strehlen, in the Prussian province of Silesia, in a region that is now part of Poland. And he showed from an early age the kind of intense, focused curiosity about the behavior of colored dyes in biological tissues that would define his scientific career, spending many hours as a medical student observing the differential uptake of aniline dyes in different cell types, and asking, with characteristic directness, why certain dyes stained certain tissues and not others. A question whose answer, he came to believe, lay in the specific chemical affinity between the dye molecule and particular receptors or structures in the target tissue. This idea of chemical specificity, of the notion that a molecule could be designed or selected to bind preferentially to a particular target while leaving other tissues relatively unaffected, was the intellectual core of what Ehrlich called his Zauberkugeln, his magic bullets, the hypothetical therapeutic agents that would be able to find and destroy a pathogen within the body without causing serious harm to the host. And it was this idea, worked out through years of laboratory experimentation with dyes, and then with arsenic compounds and their derivatives, that had produced salvarsan in 1909 and changed the history of medicine. The compound that Ehrlich and Harter identified as effective against treponema pallidum was the 606 compound they had tested in their systematic program of screening arsenic derivatives, a fact that has become one of the well-known details of the history of drug discovery, often cited as an example of the patience and methodical persistence that scientific discovery requires. And the number gave the drug its other name, compound 606, though it was sold commercially under the name salvarsan, from the Latin salvar meaning to save, and the suffix suggesting arsenic, a name that made the drug's composition and its intended effect simultaneously clear. Clinical trials of salvarsan began in 1910 with the cooperation of a network of German dermatologists and syphilologists who had access to large patient populations and who reported results with a speed and enthusiasm that reflected both the genuine efficacy of the drug and the long frustration of physicians who had been treating syphilis with mercury for 4 centuries without ever having a treatment that they could confidently say was curative rather than merely palliative. The results were not perfect. Salvarsan was itself a toxic compound and required careful dosing and administration, and it was followed in 1912 by neosalvarsan, a related compound that was somewhat easier to administer and somewhat less toxic, and the arsenic-based syphilis treatments held their position at the center of the pharmacopoeia until the introduction of penicillin in the 1940s finally provided a genuinely effective and relatively safe cure for the disease. But the significance of salvarsan for the history of mercury medicine went beyond its replacement of mercury in the specific treatment of syphilis, because the success of Ehrlich's targeted approach demonstrated with unmistakable clarity that the old model of medicine, the heroic model that used general toxins like mercury to produce dramatic systemic effects, was not merely unnecessary, but actively inferior to the new model of specific chemical therapy, and the intellectual authority of the heroic tradition began from this point to wane. Slowly, but irreversibly, in the face of the growing evidence that precision rather than power was the quality that distinguished a useful medicine from a harmful one. The years between the introduction of Salvarsan in 1910 and the end of the Second World War in 1945 were years in which Mercury's role in formal medicine contracted steadily while its presence in industrial and commercial applications continued to grow, creating a paradox of simultaneous retreat and expansion that characterized the substance's position in the early 20th century in a way that made it simultaneously less visible in the pharmacopoeia and more pervasive in the physical environment. Calomel's use as an oral medicine declined gradually through the first 3 decades of the 20th century as the accumulation of evidence against it reached a point where even the most conservative physicians found it difficult to justify. But calomel and other mercury compounds were finding new applications in agriculture, where mercurial seed dressings that protected grain against fungal infection had been in use since the early 19th century and were expanding rapidly in the early 20th as industrial farming practices increased the scale on which seeds were treated, and as the chemical industry developed more potent and more stable organomercury compounds for this purpose. The organomercury fungicides, which included compounds like methylmercury, dicyandiamide, and ethylmercury chloride, were effective at preventing the fungal diseases that could devastate grain crops, and their adoption was encouraged by agricultural authorities in Europe and North America as a contribution to the reliable food production that the growing urban populations of the industrial world required, without a full appreciation of the properties that made organomercury compounds particularly dangerous by comparison with inorganic mercury salts, namely their ability to absorb through the skin, as well as through inhalation and ingestion, their tendency to accumulate in the nervous system with particular avidity, and their capacity to cross the blood-brain barrier and the placental barrier in ways that inorganic mercury did not, or did so less readily. The distinction between inorganic mercury, which includes elemental mercury, and the mercury salts like calomel and mercuric chloride that had been the primary forms of mercury medicine, and organic mercury, in which mercury is bonded to carbon, is a distinction whose toxicological importance was not fully understood until the second half of the 20th century, when a series of disasters in Japan and elsewhere made the specific and particularly devastating toxicity of methylmercury, the simplest of the organomercury compounds, impossible to ignore and impossible to dismiss. The catastrophe that unfolded in the city of Minamata in the Kumamoto prefecture of Japan, beginning in the 1950s, is the most thoroughly documented and most tragically illustrative case in the history of mercury poisoning. And while its primary cause was the industrial discharge of mercury compounds into Minamata Bay by the Chiso Corporation's chemical plant rather than any medical use of mercury, it belongs in any complete account of mercury's history, because it established beyond any reasonable doubt the particular toxicity of methylmercury, the mechanisms by which it moved through the food chain and concentrated in the tissues of fish and the people who ate those fish, and the catastrophic neurological and developmental damage it was capable of inflicting, damage that included in its most devastating form the deformation and disability of children born to mothers who had been exposed during pregnancy, children who were known locally and then internationally as the congenital Minamata disease patients, and whose suffering became one of the most powerful arguments for the comprehensive international regulation of mercury that would eventually, after many decades of effort, produce the Minamata Convention on Mercury, adopted in 2013 and named in their honor. It was not only in Japan that the dangers of organomercury compounds were being discovered in the middle decades of the 20th century for the use of mercury-treated grain as food rather than seed. A desperate measure resorted to, in conditions of famine or supply failure, produced a series of mass poisonings in different parts of the world that added their own terrible weight to the evidence accumulating against mercury in all its forms. In Iraq, a mass poisoning event in 1971 and 1972 resulted from the distribution of methylmercury-treated wheat and barley seed to rural farmers who, unable to read the warning labels printed in Spanish and English on sacks that had been imported from Mexico and the United States, and in some cases simply Hungary, ground the grain into flour and baked it into bread that was then consumed by their families over weeks and months before the consequences became apparent. The Iraqi Ministry of Health recorded 530 cases of methylmercury poisoning from this episode, and 459 deaths, though the true figures are believed by historians of the disaster to have been considerably higher, as many cases in rural areas were never brought to medical attention. Many of those who died were buried before any diagnosis was made, and the stigma and fear surrounding the illness in the affected communities may have led to significant underreporting, even of the cases that did reach medical facilities. The clinical presentation of the Iraqi victims was consistent with what had been described in Minamata and in the earliest scientific literature on methylmercury toxicity, beginning with sensory symptoms, including numbness and tingling in the extremities, followed by visual disturbances, hearing loss, difficulty with coordination and gait, and in the most severely affected cases, profound neurological damage and death, a progression that reflected the particular affinity of methylmercury for the neurons of the sensory cortex and the cerebellum, the regions of the brain responsible for the processing of sensory information and the coordination of movement. The Iraqi disaster, which attracted international attention and produced a significant scientific literature, including a landmark study by the Iraqi physician Layman al-Damluji and colleagues, published in the Bulletin of the World Health Organization, contributed materially to the development of international standards for mercury in food and in the occupational environment, and the data gathered from the affected populations provided some of the most detailed information available about the dose-response relationship for methylmercury toxicity in humans. Information that was gathered at a terrible human cost, but that has informed every subsequent regulatory decision about acceptable mercury exposure levels. The disaster also revealed with painful clarity the ways in which the global trade in agricultural chemicals created pathways for mercury exposure in populations that had no awareness of the substance involved, no ability to read the warnings provided, and no political or economic power to demand better protection. A structural vulnerability that was present not only in Iraq, but in many other countries of the developing world, where mercury-treated agricultural products were distributed without adequate labeling or public education, and that would continue to be a feature of the global mercury problem until the development of international regulatory frameworks specifically designed to address it. The 20th century brought the sciences of neurology and neurochemistry to a level of sophistication that made it possible, for the first time, to describe with some precision what mercury does inside the nervous system at the cellular and molecular level, to trace the pathway from exposure to damage with the kind of mechanistic detail that had been entirely beyond the reach of every physician who had prescribed mercury medicine from Paracelsus to Benjamin Rush. And this new understanding, while it came too late to protect the generations of patients and workers who had already been harmed, provided the scientific foundation for the regulatory and public health measures that have since reduced, though not eliminated, the global burden of mercury poisoning. The mechanism by which methylmercury, in particular, produces its neurological effects involves the substance's high affinity for sulfhydryl groups, the reactive chemical groups present in many of the proteins that carry out essential functions in the nervous system, including the proteins that regulate the transport of ions across nerve cells' membranes, and the enzymes responsible for the synthesis and degradation of neurotransmitters, the chemical messengers that neurons use to communicate with one another. When methylmercury binds to these proteins, it interferes with their normal function, disrupting the electrical signaling of nerve cells and triggering a cascade of cellular damage. That includes the generation of reactive oxygen species, the disruption of calcium homeostasis within the neuron, and ultimately, at sufficient doses, the death of the neuron itself, a death that in the brain is permanent, because the neurons of the adult nervous system do not regenerate in the way that the cells of other tissues do, and the damage done by methylmercury to the neurons of the visual cortex or the cerebellum or the somatosensory cortex represents a permanent reduction in the function of those regions, a reduction that manifests in the patient as the loss of vision or coordination or sensation that characterizes the clinical presentation of Minamata disease. The developing nervous system, as the case of congenital Minamata disease demonstrated with devastating clarity, is even more vulnerable to methylmercury than the adult nervous system, because the neurons of the developing brain are not only dividing and migrating and forming connections at a rate that the adult brain has long since ceased to achieve, but are doing so under the guidance of signaling pathways that are exquisitely sensitive to disruption, so that a dose of methylmercury that might produce relatively subtle effects in an adult can produce profound and permanent developmental damage in a fetus. And the children born to mothers who had consumed methylmercury contaminated fish from Minamata Bay included cases of severe cerebral palsy, intellectual disability, and sensory impairment that reflected a degree of neurological disruption, simply not possible to reconcile with the continued use of mercury in any application where human exposure at those levels was a realistic possibility. The neurochemistry of inorganic mercury, including the elemental mercury vapor that was the primary form of exposure for hat makers and mirror silverers and workers in other trades, differs from that of methylmercury in ways that are toxicologically significant, but that nonetheless lead to damage of the same general character, because elemental mercury vapor, once inhaled and absorbed through the lungs into the bloodstream, is converted in the body into inorganic mercury ions that also bind to sulfhydryl groups and disrupt the function of the same neuronal proteins, producing the erethism mercurialis described by John Pearson in 1805, and the Danbury shakes described by J. Addison Freeman in 1860. Through mechanisms that were not understood at the time, those clinical descriptions were written, but that are now mapped at the molecular level with considerable precision. The precision of this understanding, the ability to point to a specific bond between a mercury atom and a specific cysteine residue in a specific protein, and to trace the consequences of that bond through the cell biology of the neuron and the systems, neuroscience of the brain, and the clinical presentation of the patient is one of the achievements of 20th century biomedical science that most directly vindicates the intuitions of the physicians who had, without any of this knowledge, recognized century by century that Mercury was doing something deeply harmful to the people they were trying to help, and that the something was connected in some way to the nervous system and the mind. By the middle decades of the 20th century, the regulatory machinery of the developed world was beginning. With the characteristic deliberateness of large institutions facing evidence they could no longer defer responding to move toward the formal restriction and eventual prohibition of mercury in its most obviously dangerous medical and commercial applications. Calomel, which had already been largely displaced from adult medicine by the development of more effective and less toxic alternatives, finally lost its last major medical use in the late 1940s and early 1950s, when the Cincinnati pediatrician John Walkeny published his landmark research in 1945 and 1948, demonstrating the connection between calomel, containing teething powders, and acrodynia, the mysterious pink disease of infancy that had been puzzling pediatricians for decades. Walkeny's work, which involved careful clinical investigation of the children affected and the identification of mercury in their urine as a consistent finding, provided the causal evidence that had been missing, and that made the continued use of calomel in products intended for children not merely controversial but indefensible, and the withdrawal of mercury-containing teething powders from the market in Britain, Australia, and the United States in the early 1950s was followed by a dramatic and rapid decline in the incidence of acrodynia, a natural experiment of the kind that medicine rarely provides with such clarity, in which the removal of a single cause produced the near disappearance of a clinical syndrome within a few years, confirming beyond reasonable doubt the causal connection that Walkeny had proposed. The case of acrodynia and calomel is in some ways the tidiest and most satisfying story in the long history of mercury medicine, a story that has a clear villain, a clear victim, a clear discovery, and a clear resolution. And that resolution, the end of calomel as a medicine for children, came more swiftly than most regulatory changes in the history of medicine, a speed that reflected both the clarity of the evidence and the particular moral weight of evidence that children were being harmed by a substance given to them by people who were trying to help them. The emotional resonance of that situation, the image of a mother unknowingly poisoning her infant with a remedy prescribed by a trusted physician, was powerful enough to overcome the usual inertia of regulatory change. And the withdrawal of calomel from pediatric use stands as one of the moments when the medical establishment acted with relative dispatch in response to evidence of harm, even if it had taken more than a century of widespread use for the harm to be formally identified and proven. And so, in the quiet of the early 1950s, in the offices of pharmaceutical companies, and the meeting rooms of regulatory bodies, and the dispensaries where calomel powder had been dispensed, for generations, another chapter of mercury medicine closed, gently and without ceremony, the way that all such chapters close, not with a declaration, but with a gradual absence, a withdrawal, a silence, where there had once been the habitual reach for the familiar white powder and the confident expectation that it would do some good. The decade of the 1950s was a decade of transition in the long history of mercury, a period in which the old certainties of mercury medicine were dissolving with a finality that even the most conservative physician could no longer deny, while the new certainties of industrial mercury use, the agricultural fungicides, and the chloralkali industry, and the scientific instrument trade were producing a different kind of mercury problem, one that was dispersed through ecosystems and food chains rather than concentrated in the physician's bag and the apothecary's cabinet. And that required a different kind of thinking to address, a thinking that connected chemistry to ecology to public health in ways that the medicine of previous centuries had never needed to contemplate. The chloralkali industry, which used mercury cells to produce chlorine and caustic soda through the electrolysis of salt water, and which had been expanding rapidly in industrialized countries since the early 20th century, was by the 1950s one of the largest single sources of mercury entering the environment, discharging mercury-containing effluents into rivers and coastal waters with a consistency and a volume that was gradually transforming the chemistry of aquatic ecosystems in ways that no one had yet fully traced. The process of mercury methylation in aquatic sediments, by which inorganic mercury discharged from industrial sources is converted by anaerobic bacteria into methylmercury, the organic form that is so readily absorbed into biological tissues, and that concentrates with such devastating efficiency as it moves up the food chain from bacteria to plankton to small fish to large fish to the human beings who eat those fish, was not understood at the level of mechanism until research conducted in the late 1960s and early 1970s finally clarified the microbiology involved. But the consequences of this process were already unfolding in Minamata Bay in the 1950s, where the fish and shellfish that had sustained the local fishing community for generations were accumulating methylmercury at concentrations high enough to produce severe neurological disease in people who ate them regularly, and where the first definitive case of what would become known as Minamata disease was reported to the Chiso Factory Hospital in April 1956 by a physician named Hajime Hosokawa, who observed in a young girl from the fishing village a constellation of neurological symptoms: difficulty walking, difficulty speaking, loss of coordination, constriction of the visual fields that he had never seen before, and that he could not immediately explain within the framework of any disease he had been trained to recognize. Hosokawa was a careful and conscientious physician, and he brought additional cases to the attention of the public health authorities with a persistence that eventually initiated the official investigation into what was initially called the strange disease of Minamata, an investigation that moved with painful slowness through the years between 1956 and 1959. As the evidence pointing to the Chiso plant's mercury discharges was assembled, challenged, suppressed, and eventually confirmed, while the residents of the fishing community continued to eat the contaminated fish, continued to develop the neurological damage, and continued to die in a process of institutional failure, so consequential and so thoroughly documented that it has become one of the foundational case studies of environmental law and public health ethics. The Chiso Corporation, which had been the primary employer and economic foundation of Minamata City since the early 20th century, and which had an obvious commercial interest in avoiding responsibility for the disease bearing the city's name, conducted its own internal research through its factory hospital, and reached conclusions pointing to mercury as the causative agent as early as 1959, conclusions that were then suppressed at the corporate level and not publicly disclosed a concealment that allowed the poisoning to continue for years after the cause was known within the company. And that contributed to the accumulation of harm in the community on a scale that the subsequent legal reckoning found difficult to adequately address. The official confirmation that organic mercury discharged from the chisoacetaldehyde plant was the cause of Minamata disease came in stages through the late 1950s and early 1960s, with the definitive identification of methylmercury as the specific toxic agent being established through the work of a team of British researchers, including Leonard Acheson and James Douglas, who demonstrated in 1959 that methylmercury compounds produced neurological damage in cats consistent with the disease seen in human patients, and through the parallel work of Japanese researchers, including Katsuro Irukayama and colleagues at Kumamoto University, who by 1963 had identified methylmercury compounds in the sludge and the fish of Minamata Bay and in the tissues of the disease victims. The legal proceedings that followed the confirmation of corporate responsibility were long, contentious, and ultimately insufficient to the scale of the harm done. The Chiso Corporation paying compensation to victims in a process that stretched across decades. And that was still generating legal disputes into the 21st century. The victims and their descendants arguing that the compensation awarded did not adequately reflect the lifelong nature of their disabilities and the multi-generational effects of congenital exposure on families who had been fishing from the same shore for generations and who had no understanding of what was happening to them until the harm was already done. The story of Minamata is a story that belongs to the history of mercury medicine, not because any physician prescribed methylmercury as a therapeutic agent, but because it is the clearest and most complete account in the historical record of what mercury, in its most biologically available form, does to a human community when it enters the food chain without warning and without regulatory control, and the lessons drawn from Minamata by the scientists and regulators and public health officials who studied it were lessons that shaped every subsequent international agreement about mercury, every subsequent standard for mercury in food and water and occupational environments, every subsequent discussion of what it means to be exposed to this element and what it means to be protected from it. The international scientific community's response to Minamata and to the other mercury disasters of the mid-20th century was gradual but cumulative, building through the 1960s and 1970s toward a new consensus about mercury as a global environmental hazard, rather than merely a local industrial problem. And this reframing of mercury from a medical and occupational concern to an environmental and ecological concern was one of the conceptual shifts that made possible the development of the international regulatory frameworks that would eventually, after many more decades of effort, produce the global treaty that bears Minamata's name. The work of the Swedish researcher Søren Jensen, who in 1966 reported the widespread occurrence of methylmercury in Swedish wildlife, particularly in predatory birds, and in the fish from Swedish lakes and rivers, and who traced this contamination to the use of organomercury compounds in Swedish agriculture, was an important early contribution to the understanding that mercury contamination was not confined to the immediate vicinity of industrial discharge points, but could spread through the environment by a variety of pathways, and could affect wildlife and human populations far from any obvious point source. Jensen's work contributed to the Swedish government's decision to restrict and then prohibit the use of organomercury seed dressings in Swedish agriculture in the late 1960s, making Sweden one of the first countries to take legislative action against organomercury in agriculture. And the Swedish example influenced the thinking of environmental regulators in other countries who were beginning to grapple with the same issues. The United States Environmental Protection Agency, established in 1970, in a period of growing public concern about industrial pollution and environmental degradation, took early action against mercury discharges into waterways, issuing regulations that required the reduction of mercury emissions from chloralkali plants and other industrial sources, and the passage of the Clean Water Act in 1972 provided the legal framework for enforceable standards that had been largely absent from the American regulatory landscape in the decades when the worst mercury contamination of American waterways was occurring. The banning of most uses of organomercury pesticides in the United States in the 1970s, following the Iraqi grain poisoning of 1971 and 1972, and the accumulating evidence of environmental contamination, removed one of the largest single sources of mercury in American agriculture, though the agricultural use of mercury-based fungicides continued in many other countries for years and decades after the American and European prohibitions, reflecting the uneven global distribution of regulatory capacity and political will that continues to characterize the management of chemical hazards in the contemporary world. The discovery that elemental mercury vapor from coal combustion was contributing significantly to the global cycling of mercury, entering the atmosphere from power plant smokestacks and being deposited across vast areas of ocean and land surface, added a dimension to the mercury problem that made purely national regulatory approaches inadequate, because the mercury emitted by a coal-fired power plant in China or India or the United States crossed borders and oceans in the atmosphere and was deposited in ecosystems far from its point of emission, methylated by aquatic bacteria, concentrated in fish, and ultimately consumed by people who had no way of knowing that the mercury in their meal had originated in a power plant on the other side of the world. The global nature of mercury cycling meant that effective regulation required international cooperation of a kind that had not yet been achieved for any other toxic metal, a cooperation that would require decades of scientific assessment and diplomatic negotiation to achieve, and that would not be formalized until the adoption of the Minamata Convention in 2013. The monitoring programs and epidemiological studies of the 1980s and 1990s, particularly those conducted in populations with high fish consumption, such as the fishing communities of the Faroe Islands and the Seychelles, produced results that were carefully watched by regulators and scientists alike, because they addressed the question of whether methylmercury at the lower levels of exposure, typical of fish-eating populations, rather than the extreme levels seen in Minamata or the Iraqi grain poisoning, produced measurable effects on neurodevelopment in children exposed in the womb. And the results of these studies, which showed associations between prenatal methylmercury exposure and subtle deficits in attention, memory, and fine motor function in children, even at relatively low exposure levels, became central to the debates about acceptable levels of mercury in fish and about the advisability of recommending fish consumption to pregnant women. These debates, which continue in modified form to the present day, reflect the genuine difficulty of balancing the nutritional benefits of fish consumption, which are real and substantial, against the risks of methylmercury exposure, which are real and well documented, and the precautionary advisories issued by health authorities in many countries recommending that pregnant women limit their consumption of certain high mercury fish species while continuing to eat fish generally represent an attempt to navigate this tension with the incomplete but growing evidence available. The history of mercury in the 20th century is also, and unexpectedly, a history of medicine continuing to use mercury in new contexts, even as it withdrew mercury from old ones, finding in the element's chemical properties new applications that were each, in their time, regarded as beneficial, and whose safety was each, in its time, subject to varying degrees of scrutiny and debate. The organomercury compound thiomersal, also known as thimerosal, which was developed in the late 1920s by the American chemist Maurice Karash, working at the Eli Lilly Company, found widespread use as a preservative in vaccines and other biological products from the 1930s onward. Its ability to prevent bacterial and fungal contamination of multi-dose vaccine vials, making it a practical solution to a genuine safety problem in the mass vaccination programs that were becoming a cornerstone of public health in the developed world. Thiomersal contains ethyl mercury rather than methyl mercury, a distinction that its defenders have consistently emphasized because ethyl mercury is metabolized and excreted by the body considerably more rapidly than methyl mercury, with a half-life in blood of approximately 7 days compared to methyl mercury's approximately 50 days. And the regulatory bodies that have reviewed the evidence on thiomersal safety, including the World Health Organization's Strategic Advisory Group of Experts on Immunization, have consistently concluded that the evidence does not support a causal link between thiomersal containing vaccines and any adverse neurological outcome in the children who receive them. The controversy about thiomersal and autism that erupted in the late 1990s following a 1998 paper by Andrew Wakefield in The Lancet, which suggested a connection between the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine and autism, and that spilled over into concerns about the thiomersal used in other childhood vaccines, produced one of the most thoroughly investigated and most extensively debated episodes in the history of vaccine safety, generating hundreds of epidemiological studies, multiple systematic reviews, and an Institute of Medicine report in 2004 that concluded the evidence favored rejection of a causal relationship between thiomersal containing vaccines and autism. The withdrawal of thiomersal from most childhood vaccines in the United States, beginning in 1999 as a precautionary measure, despite the absence of evidence of harm and the subsequent stability of autism prevalence rates. Despite this withdrawal, provided additional epidemiological evidence against the proposed association, and the scientific consensus on thiomersal safety has remained stable and consistent in the years since, even as the public controversy has continued in some communities, driven by the understandable but scientifically unsupported anxieties of parents, seeking explanations for a condition that remains incompletely understood. The thiomersal debate, whatever its ultimate scientific resolution, illustrates something important about the long history of mercury medicine, namely that the element's history of documented harm has given it a cultural weight and an emotional resonance that make it a particularly potent focus for anxieties about medicine and the safety of medical interventions, so that even applications of mercury that the scientific evidence regards as safe are subject to a level of public scrutiny and emotional concern that reflects not only the specific evidence about the application in question, but the accumulated memory, conscious and unconscious, of 4 centuries of mercury medicine gone wrong. The memory of calomel given to infants, of hat makers shaking with neurological damage, of the mothers of Minima watching their children born with damage that had no cure, is present in the cultural background of every contemporary debate about mercury in any form, and it shapes those debates in ways that are not always transparent, but that are nonetheless real and significant. Mercury's continuing presence in fluorescent light bulbs, in dental amalgam, in certain industrial processes, in the fish that people eat, and in the global atmosphere circulated by weather systems that do not respect national boundaries, means that the element's history is not yet complete, that the story of humanity's relationship with this particular substance is still being written in the epidemiological studies and the regulatory meetings and the international negotiations and the quiet daily choices of people who are trying to eat well and live safely in a world where mercury, in various concentrations and various forms, remains an inescapable presence. The arc of that history, from Paracelsus prescribing mercury ointment to syphilis patients in the 16th century, to the delegates negotiating the Minamata Convention in the 21st, is long and complicated and full of the kinds of turns that only make sense in retrospect, and it is an arc that has not yet reached its conclusion. The development of occupational health standards for mercury exposure in the 20th century represents one of the quieter but more consequential chapters in the regulatory history of the element, a story of gradual institutional learning, carried out in industrial hygiene laboratories and factory, medical departments, and government offices, rather than in courtrooms or headlines, but whose outcomes, in terms of reduced occupational mercury exposure among workers in mines and chemical, plants and dental offices, and scientific instrument factories, have been substantial and measurable, even if the process of arriving at those outcomes was slow and contested at every step. The concept of a maximum allowable concentration for mercury in workplace air, a number below which exposure was regarded as safe, and above which it was regarded as requiring remediation, was developed through the work of industrial hygienists and occupational physicians in the United States and Europe during the 1930s and 1940s, with the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists publishing its first list of threshold limit values for workplace chemical exposures in 1946, and mercury appearing on that list with a value that has been revised downward several times in subsequent decades as the understanding of mercury's neurological effects at lower exposure levels has become more precise. The revision history of the threshold limit value for mercury vapor, from the initial value of 100 micrograms per cubic meter of air published in the 1940s to the current value of 25 micrograms per cubic meter, recommended by the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, reflects in numerical form the arc of scientific understanding about mercury toxicity over the past 8 decades, each downward revision representing the absorption into regulatory practice of new evidence about harm at levels that had previously been regarded as safe. The physicians who worked in occupational medicine through the middle decades of the 20th century, examining workers in chloralkali plants and thermometer factories and dental offices, and conducting biological monitoring programs that measured mercury levels in the urine and blood of exposed workers, accumulated an understanding of the spectrum of mercury's effects at different exposure levels that was qualitatively different from anything available to their predecessors because they had access to the analytical chemistry and the epidemiological methods and the clinical neurological testing that made it possible to detect subtle effects at low exposures, effects that earlier generations of physicians had missed entirely because they lacked the tools to see them. The dental profession's own reckoning with mercury exposure among dentists and dental nurses was one of the occupational health stories of the late 20th century, driven by studies showing that dental workers had elevated mercury levels in their urine and blood compared to the general population, and that some of those workers showed neurological and reproductive effects at the levels of exposure involved, findings that prompted revisions to the standards for mercury handling in dental offices, including improved ventilation, the use of pre-capsulated amalgam that did not require hand mixing, and protocols for the safe disposal of mercury waste that were designed to protect not only the dental workers, but the environment into which mercury-containing dental waste would otherwise be discharged. The gradual improvement in workplace mercury controls through the second half of the 20th century, while it did not eliminate occupational mercury exposure, substantially reduced the prevalence of erythism, mercurialis, and the other manifestations of chronic mercury poisoning among workers in industrialized countries. And the hat-making industry, which had been transformed by the introduction of synthetic fibers and changes in fashion that had already made the felt hat a less dominant item of clothing, had largely abandoned the mercury carotting process by the mid-20th century, removing one of the longest-standing sources of occupational mercury exposure in the artisanal trades. The legacy of that exposure in the bodies of the workers who had carried it for decades, in the retired hat makers of Danbury, with their trembling hands and their quiet days, remained, as the legacies of such things always remain, long after the source had been removed, a reminder that the body keeps its own records of the substances it has encountered, records that are written not in paper, but in the accumulated damage of years. The Minamata Convention on Mercury, adopted at the diplomatic conference held in Kumamoto, Japan, in October 2013, and named explicitly for the city and the community where the consequences of unregulated mercury had been most catastrophically documented, represents the culmination of decades of international scientific work and diplomatic negotiation, and marks the first time in the history of international environmental law that a comprehensive global treaty was developed specifically to address a single chemical element in all its major uses and emission sources. The process that led to the Minamata Convention began formally with a decision by the United Nations Environment Programme Governing Council in 2009 to initiate negotiations toward a global legally binding instrument on mercury, a decision that was itself the result of years of advocacy by environmental health scientists and public health advocates and representatives of affected communities, particularly from the Arctic, where indigenous populations whose traditional diet was heavily dependent on marine mammals and large fish were facing methylmercury exposures far higher than those of most populations in the temperate regions, from which most of the mercury in the Arctic environment was originating. A spatial injustice of particularly striking character, in which communities that had contributed nothing to the industrial and agricultural mercury releases driving global contamination were bearing a disproportionate share of the health consequences. The 5 rounds of intergovernmental negotiating committee meetings that preceded the adoption of the convention held in various locations between 2010 and 2013, addressed an extraordinary range of mercury uses and mercury sources, from artisanal and small-scale gold mining, which by the early 21st century had become the single largest source of intentional mercury use in the world, to the phase down of mercury-containing medical devices, including thermometers and blood pressure measuring devices, to the regulation of emissions from coal-fired power plants, to the management of mercury waste and the cleanup of contaminated sites, to the restrictions on the manufacture, import, and export of mercury-added products, including certain types of batteries, switches, relays, and fluorescent lamps. The artisanal gold mining sector presented particular challenges for the negotiators because the use of mercury to amalgamate gold from ore, a technique that is essentially the same as the tin amalgam process used in mirror making centuries earlier, and that relies on mercury's property of forming amalgams with many metals, was providing a livelihood for an estimated 15 million miners in more than 70 countries, many of them in the poorest and most vulnerable communities in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, for whom the availability of mercury and the simplicity of the amalgamation process represented an accessible pathway to a subsistence income that no alternative technology had yet matched in practical and economic terms. The convention's approach to artisanal gold mining reflected the diplomatic reality that outright prohibition was neither achievable nor desirable when the alternative was not a cleaner mining method, but poverty and its consequences, and the text adopted required signatory countries to develop national action plans to reduce mercury use in the sector and to promote the development and adoption of mercury-free alternatives, a softer approach than environmental advocates had sought, but one that reflected the legitimate complexity of a situation in which human health and environmental protection on one side were balanced against economic survival, and the absence of viable alternatives on the other. The Convention's requirements on emissions from coal-fired power plants, which represented one of the largest sources of atmospheric mercury globally, were also the subject of intensive negotiation, with the coal-dependent economies of Asia and elsewhere pressing for flexibility in implementation timelines and in the standards applied, and the final text establishing requirements for best available techniques and best environmental practices in a framework that allowed for national circumstances while maintaining the principle of progressive reduction of coal combustion mercury emissions over time. The adoption of the Minamata Convention was received with considerable emotion by the survivors of Minamata disease and their families and advocates who were present at the ceremony in Kumamoto, for whom the naming of the treaty was an act of recognition for a community that had waited more than half a century for the international acknowledgement of what had been done to them. And photographs from the ceremony show elderly men and women, some of them survivors of congenital Minamata disease, with the visible signs of their neurological damage still present in their bodies, and their movements weeping at the moment of adoption, a sight that captures in human terms what the dry language of treaty text cannot convey about the long and painful journey from the first recognized cases of mercury poisoning in a Japanese fishing village to the first global agreement to control the element that had caused it. The Minamata Convention entered into force in August 2017, following ratification by 50 countries, and as of the early 2020s, more than 140 countries had become parties to it, a broad adherence that reflects the global consensus on mercury as a substance requiring coordinated international management, even as the practical implementation of the convention's requirements continues to present challenges in many jurisdictions. And as the process of phasing down mercury in its remaining uses proceeds at a pace that is sometimes slower than the public health evidence would suggest, is optimal. The science of mercury toxicology in the early 21st century is a mature and sophisticated discipline, far removed from the tentative clinical observations of John Pearson in 1805, or the first experimental descriptions of methylmercury toxicity in the 1950s. And it encompasses not only the classical neurotoxicology that describes the effects of mercury on the nervous system, but also the epidemiology of mercury exposure in global populations, the biogeochemistry of mercury cycling through the atmosphere and the oceans and the food chain, the molecular biology of mercury's interactions with cellular proteins and signaling pathways, and the emerging field of mercury genomics, which examines the ways in which individual genetic variation influences susceptibility to mercury's toxic effects, and may eventually allow the identification of populations at particular risk who would benefit most from targeted reductions in exposure. The global burden of mercury exposure, as estimated by the World Health Organization and other international bodies, represents a public health challenge of considerable scale, with the primary pathway of concern being the consumption of methylmercury contaminated fish by pregnant women and women of childbearing age, given the particular vulnerability of the developing nervous system to this form of mercury, and estimates suggest that tens of millions of children worldwide are born each year with prenatal methylmercury exposures in ranges that the epidemiological literature associates with subtle but real reductions in cognitive function, a burden of neurodevelopmental impact that is invisible in any individual case, but that translates at the population level into a measurable reduction in human cognitive potential with economic as well as humanitarian consequences. The dental amalgam question, which has been a recurring feature of the mercury debate since the first amalgam war of the 1840s, remains unresolved, in the sense that different regulatory bodies have reached different conclusions about the appropriate use of amalgam in different populations, with the European Union having moved toward phasing out amalgam use in children under 15, pregnant women, and breastfeeding women in recent regulatory updates, while other jurisdictions continue to regard amalgam as safe for general use, pending more definitive evidence of harm at the levels of mercury release associated with normal amalgam fillings, and the debate continues in the scientific and regulatory literature with the measured tones of people who understand that both the evidence and the stakes are real, and that neither side of the argument is without substance. The development of effective, accessible, and affordable alternatives to mercury in the remaining applications where it continues to be used, including dental amalgam, certain types of electrical equipment, artisanal gold mining, and some laboratory applications, is a research and development priority that has attracted growing attention and funding in the era of the Minamata Convention, with progress being made in each area, but with the pace of that progress remaining uneven, and the commercial and practical barriers to adoption remaining significant in many contexts, particularly in the lower income countries where mercury use is most concentrated, and where the resources to facilitate transitions to mercury-free alternatives are least available. The atmospheric modeling of global mercury cycling, which has become possible through the development of sophisticated computational tools and the expansion of the global mercury monitoring network, has produced projections suggesting that even with full implementation of the Minamata Convention's requirements, the legacy mercury that has accumulated in ocean sediments and terrestrial soils from centuries of industrial and pre-industrial mercury use will continue to cycle through the environment and to enter the food chain for decades and centuries to come, a finding that underlines both the persistence of this element's presence in human affairs and the importance of the reductions in ongoing emissions and uses that the convention is designed to achieve. The fish consumption advisories issued by health authorities in many countries recommending that pregnant women limit their intake of high mercury species such as shark, swordfishish, king mackerel, and tilefish, while continuing to eat lower mercury fish species for their nutritional benefits, represent one of the practical public health tools for managing mercury exposure in populations where fish consumption is both a cultural tradition and an important source of nutrition, and the communication of these advisories to the people who need to act on them in accessible language and through trusted channels and with cultural sensitivity to the communities involved is one of the ongoing challenges of mercury public health practice. The story of mercury toxicology is not, in any real sense, complete because the element continues to move through the environment, continues to enter the food chain, continues to be used in applications whose safety remains subject to active scientific investigation and continues to be the subject of regulatory decisions that affect the health of people who will never know the name Paracelsus or the Danbury, shakes, or the strange disease of Minamata, but who are nonetheless living with the long consequences of 4 centuries of human engagement with a silver liquid metal that was, for so long, so much easier to use than to understand. The history of mercury in art and culture, which runs as a quiet counterpoint to the medical and industrial histories that have occupied most of this telling, offers a different kind of illumination, a view of how this extraordinary substance was experienced and represented, and given meaning by the people who encountered it not in clinical contexts, but in the imaginative and symbolic life of their time. Mercury, known to the alchemists as quicksilver, and associated with the planet Mercury, and with the god Hermes Mercury, messenger of the gods, had in the alchemical tradition a symbolic significance that went far beyond its chemical properties, representing, in the complex symbolic language of alchemy, the principle of fluidity and transformation, the capacity of matter to change its state and its character, the impossibility of fixing the unfixable, and the tradition of alchemical symbolism that surrounded Mercury in the European imagination, from the medieval period through the Renaissance, and beyond gave the element a cultural weight that influenced how it was perceived, even by people who never engaged with alchemy directly. The color vermilion, the bright red pigment derived from cinnabar, the mercury ore that is mercuric sulfide, was one of the most prized pigments in medieval and Renaissance art, used by painters including Cimabue and Giotto, and later the Flemish masters, to produce the brilliant reds that appear in illuminated manuscripts and altarpieces and portraits of the period, and the presence of mercury at the very origin of some of the most celebrated images in the history of Western art is a detail that most viewers of those images will never know, a hidden chemical history visible only to those who look with the right kind of attention. The medical applications of mercury also left traces in the literature and drama of the periods when mercury treatment was most widespread, traces that range from the somewhat ironic references in Shakespeare's plays to the venereal disease treatment of his time, references that would have been immediately understood by a London theatre audience in the 1590s, and that reflect the familiarity of the treatment and the cultural anxiety surrounding both the disease and its remedy, to the more explicitly critical writings of the poets and satirists of the 18th century who attacked the physicians of their age for the violence of their mercurial treatments and the indifference of their bedside manner.
The figure of the sweating tub.
The wooden enclosure in which syphilis patients were subjected to mercury fumigation appears in the medical satires of the 18th century as a symbol of the physician's willingness to inflict suffering in the name of cure, and the suffering endured in those tubs, which we have described clinically, and at a careful distance in this account, was understood by the patients who endured it with a visceral and personal intensity that no clinical description can fully convey, and that found its way into the literature of the age in metaphors of fire and flood, and the laborious crossing of a desert that had no certain end. Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, published in 1865, gives us in the Mad Hatter one of the most enduring and widely recognized cultural representations of mercury poisoning in the English language. Even if, as has been noted, the specific model for the character was not himself a hat maker, and not himself mercury poisoned, because the figure worked as a cultural type precisely because the mercury poisoned hat maker was familiar enough to a Victorian readership that a Mad Hatter required no explanation, and the whimsy and the disconnection and the illogic of Carroll's Hatter carry within them, however lightly and however playfully, something of the genuine neurological experience of the men who had breathed mercury vapour in the workshops of Danbury and Luton and Paris. The 20th century produced its own cultural representations of mercury, from the paintings of the Minamata photographer W. Eugene Smith, whose images of the disease victims and their families, taken in the early 1970s and published in Life magazine, brought the suffering of the Minamata community to international attention with a visual power that no amount of epidemiological data could match, to the environmental movement's adoption of mercury as a symbol of industrial pollution, and the failure of regulatory oversight, a symbol whose effectiveness derived from the long and well-documented history of mercury's harms that we have traced in this telling. The thermometer, that most domestic and most familiar of mercury's applications, which sat in the medicine cabinet of almost every home in the developed world through most of the 20th century, its thin column of silver rising and falling with the body temperature of feverish children and anxious adults, has been largely replaced by digital alternatives in the early 21st century, not because the mercury thermometer was inaccurate, but because the mercury it contained, if the thermometer was broken, posed an exposure risk that was no longer regarded as acceptable, and its removal from the home represents in miniature the broader process of mercury's withdrawal from everyday life that has been the direction of travel for the past half-century, a withdrawal that is incomplete and that will not be complete for many decades yet, but that is real, and that reflects the genuine absorption by human institutions of the lessons of the long history this telling has attempted to trace. The mines of Almaden in the province of Ciudad Real in the region of Castilla-La Mancha in central Spain, which supplied mercury to the world for more than 2,000 years, and which were for much of that time the single most important source of mercury on Earth, closed for mining operations in 2003, after the European Union's restrictions on mercury use had reduced demand to a level that made continued extraction uneconomical, and the closure of those ancient mines marks as clearly as any single event the end of an era in the history of Mercury, the close of a chapter that had opened in the Roman period and had run through the centuries of mercury medicine and mercury mirror making and mercury hat making, and the whole long catalogue of the element's uses and misuses. The Almaden mines are now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized for their extraordinary industrial and cultural significance, and visitors to the site can walk through tunnels that were worked by slaves and convicts and free miners across 2 millennia, can see the furnaces where cinnabar was roasted to drive off the sulfur and collect the mercury, can stand in the spaces where the element that moved through so many chapters of human history was first brought to the surface, and can attempt, if they choose, to hold in mind the full weight of what that element did in the world, the medicines and the poisons and the mirrors and the hats and the treaties and the tears. The Idrija mine in what is now Slovenia, the second largest mercury mine in the history of the world, also closed in the late 20th century. After centuries of production, and its archive of mining records stretching back to the late 15th century contains within it a detailed and almost unbroken account of mercury extraction and trade through the entire period of mercury medicine, from the first decades when mercury from Idrija was being sent to Venice, and from Venice to the physicians of Europe who were beginning to treat syphilis with it, to the final decades of declining demand and increasing regulatory pressure that preceded the mine's closure. The workers who laboured in these mines across their centuries of operation were, like the hat makers of Danbury and the mirror silverers of Venice, among the most heavily mercury-exposed human beings who ever lived, breathing cinnabar dust and mercury vapour in tunnels and processing rooms, where the concentrations of the element in the air were, by any modern standard, far beyond any threshold regarded as safe, and the skeletal remains recovered from historical burial sites associated with the Almaden and Idrija mines show the dental damage and the bone changes associated with mercury exposure that confirm what the documentary records suggest, that the miners paid for the world's mercury supply with their health and often with their lives, and that their sacrifice, if it can be called that, was the silent foundation of everything that mercury medicine and mercury industry built upon it. The contemporary legacies of these mines includes not only the cultural heritage that UNESCO recognition seeks to preserve, but also the environmental contamination of the soils and waterways in their vicinity, where centuries of mercury processing have left concentrations of the element in the land that continue to present risks to local populations and that are the subject of ongoing remediation efforts, a physical reminder that the end of mercury mining does not mean the end of mercury's presence in the places where it was mined and processed. The global inventory of mercury in the environment, compiled by scientists working within the framework established by the Minamata Convention, includes not only the ongoing emissions from coal combustion and artisanal gold mining and other current sources, but the legacy mercury that was released into the environment across centuries of industrial and pre-industrial use. And that continues to cycle through the atmosphere and the oceans and the food chain at rates that are now being carefully measured and modeled. And the conclusion of that modeling is that the mercury problem cannot be solved in a single generation, that the actions taken today will take decades to produce their full effect, and that The children who will feel the benefits of the Minamata Convention most completely are not yet born. The thread that connects Paracelsus in his alchemical study in the 16th century to the delegates signing the Minamata Convention in Kumamoto in 213 is a thread made of genuine human need and genuine human ingenuity and genuine human error, and running through all of it, the quiet persistence of a single element, number 80, in the periodic table, the only metal that is liquid at the temperature of an ordinary room on an ordinary day, silvery and dense and oddly, persistently beautiful, a beauty that has enchanted and misled, and in some ways guided the human relationship with this substance across all the centuries of its use. The physicians who prescribed mercury medicine were not wicked people, and the apothecaries who prepared it were not negligent people, and the hat makers who breathed its vapor were not careless people, and the miners who extracted it from the earth were not unaware of their sacrifice, and the industrialists who discharged it into Minamata Bay were capable, under the pressure of evidence and law, of something like remorse, though the remorse came slowly and incompletely, and never quite caught up to the harm it was responding to. The history of humanity's relationship with Mercury's is, at its deepest level, a history of the limits of knowledge, a story about how long it takes to understand the consequences of what we do, about how institutions resist the revision of their practices, even in the face of accumulating evidence, about how economic interest and epistemic uncertainty are capable together of sustaining harmful practices far longer than either alone could manage, and about how the evidence eventually wins, not cleanly or quickly or without great cost, but wins nonetheless, in the form of a withdrawal, a regulation, a treaty, a threshold revised downward, a teething powder removed from the shelf. The philosophical dimension of this history, which we have touched lightly throughout this telling, and which deserves a moment of quiet reflection in its closing passages, is the question of what a substance can mean to a civilization. How an element with a particular set of chemical properties can become embedded in the practices and the symbols and the fears of a culture over centuries, can accumulate meaning the way mercury accumulates in tissues, and can become almost possible to think about clearly because of the weight of everything that has been thought about it before. Mercury has been the messenger of the gods and the cure for the great pox and the madness of the hat maker and the poison of the bay and the subject of an international treaty, and each of these identities is real and each is partial, and none of them alone is adequate to the complexity of the substance and the history, and the attempt to hold all of them together in a single mind at a single moment is the kind of attempt that history makes possible, and that sleep, in its gentle dissolution of categories, sometimes accomplishes more completely than waking thought ever can. The world that Mercury built, or helped to build, the world of the grand mirrors of Versailles, and the felt hats of Victorian gentlemen, and the pharmacopoeia of the apothecary, and the dental amalgam of the 20th century, is a world that is still present in fragments around us, visible in the archives of medical history and the collections of natural history museums and the catalogues of antique dealers and the memories of the oldest workers in the oldest trades, a world that is receding but not yet gone, still close enough to touch if one reaches back through time with the patient, unhurried attention that history rewards. And so the long story of mercury medicine draws toward its resting place, not an ending exactly, because the element remains in the world and the work of managing it continues, but a point at which the narrative has traced its arc from beginning to middle, to a present that is still unfolding, from the candlelit apothecary shop where a physician reached for the mercury ointment because he had nothing else to reach for, to the conference room in Kumamoto, where diplomats chose a name that acknowledged the full weight of what Mercury had done to the most vulnerable of its communities. The physicians and the patients and the miners and the hat makers and the mirror makers and the dental workers and the fishing families and the toxicologists and the industrial hygienists and the environmental lawyers and the Minamata survivors in their wheelchairs weeping at a signing ceremony are all part of a single story, a story of a civilization trying, across many centuries and many failures and many sorrows, to understand the world well enough to stop doing harm, and not always succeeding, but trying persistently and with a sincerity that the suffering involved makes all the more poignant. The science of mercury is better now than it has ever been. The regulation of mercury is more comprehensive now than it has ever been. And the exposure of human populations to mercury is lower now in most parts of the world than it has been at any time in the past 400 years. And these are genuine achievements, hard-won and incomplete but real. And they represent the accumulated effect of all the physicians who noticed the tremors and wrote them down, and all the researchers who traced the pathways and published the findings, and all the advocates who took the findings to the policymakers and refused to be dismissed, and all the diplomats who sat in the negotiating rooms and worked through the language of an international treaty, line by line, and all the survivors who bore witness to what mercury had done to them and to their children and to their communities, and who insisted that it be remembered. Here in the quiet of this night, with the long history of mercury medicine settled gently around you, like the pages of an old book that has been read to the end, you are resting in a world that is, in this small and specific way, a little safer than the world of Paracelsus, a little safer than the world of Benjamin Rush, a little safer than the world of the hat makers of Danbury. And that safety, however partial and however much work remains to be done to extend and deepen it, is the slow and patient and very human achievement of everyone whose name appears in this telling, and of everyone whose name does not. The church bells of the old European city toll the late hour somewhere in the distance of time, and the candles are guttering out in the apothecary shop, and the physician is closing his leather bag and making his way home through the dark streets, and the hat makers are laying down their brushes and covering the vats for the night, and somewhere in a laboratory, someone is writing up the results of a study that will, in 20 years, change what is understood about a threshold value for a metal in the air of a workplace. And somewhere in a conference room, someone is drafting a paragraph of a treaty that will, when it finally comes into force, reduce the amount of mercury entering the ocean by some measurable fraction. And all of it is the same story, the old slow story of human beings, trying to live well in a world they do not fully understand. And all of it has brought you here, to this moment, to this breath, to the safe and heavy stillness of a body at rest, with the past drifting away like smoke from a candle that has just been extinguished, rising and thinning and disappearing into the dark. And nothing left now but the quiet and the dark and the deep and dreamless rest that comes when the long telling is done.